Welcome to Radio Free South Africa. This is your host, Karen Smith. Tonight we are going to do part 3 of our overview of South African history. Last month we covered the apartheid years, which ran from 1948 to approximately 1988, which is when apartheid started being dismantled. We've covered the reasons for apartheid and the good and bad that was caused by apartheid. Tonight, we would like to cover some of the figures that had a big part in the apartheid movement. We covered the Soweto riots and we covered Sharpeville last time. Tonight, I'd like to talk about Nelson Mandela, who was a great part and a leader in all of these riots and bombings in South Africa. But before we begin, I think it is very important that we fast forward a little to today. Because what is happening in South Africa at this moment has an enormous, or is going to have an enormous impact on the future of whites in South Africa. There is a war brewing between the ANC and President Zuma and Julius Malema, the young firebrand who leads the economic freedom fighters. Things are hotting up and things are not looking very good. So tonight, as always on our history segment, we have as our guest Schalk van der Merwe. Welcome back on the show, Schalk.
Thank you very much, Karen. It's a pleasure to be back.
It is really lovely to have you, Schalk. So I'm very concerned about the latest happenings in the South African political scene between the EFF and President Zuma, because he and Julius Malema appear to have a full-on fight going, which is going to affect the whole of South Africa. But me not being there, I only read about it, and you don't read all the ins and outs of things in the paper because they don't publish very much. So if you'd like to tell us a little about starting with the anti-racism things that started at the beginning of this year, because this affects all the laws that are being made now.
Yes, that's indeed so, Karen. Maybe I can just give the American listeners a little bit of background so that they know where who fits in. The African National Congress, as your regular listeners will know, it's a very old organization. It was formed around 1918 already, and then as of 1994, it's been the ruling party in South Africa, the African Nationalist Congress. And its current president of the party and of South Africa, by virtue of our constitution, is Jacob Zuma. Now, the ANC also has a youth wing, the ANC Youth League, and this is where this young firebrand Malema came from. Originally, he was the leader of the ANC Youth League, and at the time, at the Polokwane Congress of the ANC a couple of years back, what happened was that the Youth League backed Zuma when he wanted to take over the power in the ANC and the country, and they disposed of Thabo Mbeki, the previous president, and they were actually the kingmakers. The ANC Youth League and Malema was the kingmakers at that Polokwane Congress, where they instituted Zuma as the party leader and the country's president. So at that point in time, Malema was totally pro-Zuma. He was one of Zuma's closest followers. He stated in the media at that time that he will die for Zuma and all these big emotional things and support he gave to Zuma and his faction. But as time progressed, the relationship between the two of them on a personal level and also on a political level started to become sour. And then at one point, it deteriorated to where Malema was literally kicked out of the ANC. Now, at that stage, everybody thought that it was the end of Malema, because at that he was already extremely racist in his view of things, and anti-white and radical. So everybody thought that would be the end of Malema. But everybody was mistaken, because he then went and he formed his own party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF, which is black nationalist, but it's also Marxist, Leninist, communist. It's a far leftist type of organization. And in the last elections, a year and a half back in South African national elections, they actually had 1 million voters already voting for them. So it's still not a very big party. That the ANC garnered about 7 to 8 million votes, but 1 million votes in your first election shows that at that stage already there was a huge following to the EFF. What the EFF is doing, they are rebranding basically what was the old radical way of thinking inside the ANC. So they rebranded it to become their own, and the promises that the ANC made but never kept, those are now the promises that Malema is telling his followers. And it all goes about nationalization of banks and mines, and taking the land from the white people, and taking the businesses from the white people, and even going so far as he stated it in so many words: we will take your belongings, white people.
Yes.
So it's this whole race narrative and rhetoric that's bound to his so-called economic freedom. Now, very curiously, the EFF now takes most of its support from two power bases: the very, very, very poor black people, who are now even more poor, much more disenfranchised than they were ever under the apartheid system. So that's the first power base. But then also the new, it's called the Black Diamonds in South Africa, the new black middle class, who actually benefited from the policies of the ANC. Many of them are now looking to Malema as their next big Mandela, their next big savior, and to even take the revolution in South Africa further, and to gain even more economic power in South Africa. So that's in short just the background to it, so that people can understand who's who and where do they fit in.
Schalk, did
Yes.
Julius Malema not go to Cuba and to Venezuela to get some ideas on how these things should be done? And is he also not a fan, if not a student, of Bob Mugabe of Zimbabwe?
Yes, that's indeed so. His whole view of things is extremely, it's like 1960s, 1950s, 1960s Cuba. Um, Hardline communist. That's the starting point of his view of things, his rhetoric. So you're quite right. He, amongst others, visited Cuba. He also went to Venezuela, and he's promoting Venezuela now. Everybody knows there's nothing going on anymore in that country, but he's promoting that as now the model that he wants to come and institute in South Africa, because in his view, his very limited view of what's going on around him, that now seems to be the utopia. That is where society is supposed to go. That's his ideological background. But there's also something very strange now. He didn't only go to Venezuela and Cuba. He also went to Britain. And in Britain, he was seen in the powerful circles of many of the big banking and capitalist organizations there. And it was very curious that after he came back from Britain, he changed his rhetoric a little bit from where he wanted to nationalize everything to where it became very hardline anti-Afrikaner.
Yes.
Now that's significant, because if you know the history of South Africa, you know there's always been this huge power struggle between the Afrikaner people in South Africa and British colonialism. Always.
Yes.
That's the key running through, the golden thread running through 300 years, 250 years of South African history. So it's very interesting. Um, And then of course you had all the anti-racist. Now once again in South Africa, to a certain extent also in the United States, racist is actually a code word for white people that don't want to conform. That's
Yes,
basically
yes.
what a racist is supposed to be. So in South Africa, if you speak of anti-racism, you're not referring to racism as one race seeing itself superior to the other. You're speaking about anti-white. Anti-racist is anti-white. That's the narrative you have in South Africa. So from the start of this year, even a little bit further down into the last year, you had a huge
Upsurge.
upcoming of this upsurge of the anti-racist sentiment in the media and amongst the people, the black people themselves. Um, so this is now running
And the
in
liberal intelligentsia in South Africa.
yeah, yes, of course, of course. Let me give a little bit of background to that also. When I read the American newspapers, it's always very strange to me how polarized your nation has become between the liberal left, the Democratic Party, and the Republicans on the other side. Now, in South Africa, what you have, we have maybe times four or times five, because you have all the Afrikaner people, white people, also English speaking people who are conservative. And then you have this, you quite rightly point them out as liberal intelligentsia, who is in control of the media, in control at this point in time of many of the old white universities. That's driving an extreme anti-white agenda by themselves. So you also find it from that. So you have a lot of black people running around and saying we are now anti-racist, but you will find many times that the actual leaders of those organizations are white liberals.
Yes,
Afrikaans and English.
yes.
There's no distinction. You find extremely left-wing Afrikaner people also. Um, so that's basically a background. So now you have the EFF starting to flex its muscles. It's definitely getting support from outside. There's no two ways about it. The ANC even went so far as to say it's the Americans, and it was laughed off. I will leave it there. So this is now yes, Karen.
No, I'm just giggling. That's a very good idea to just leave it there.
Yes,
I think they said
yes.
everything that needed to be said.
Yeah, because everybody is now accusing everybody of everything. So
Mm.
it's very difficult to really cut to the chase
So
of
shall
what's
we
going
just
on.
call it as the ANC does, the third force?
Yeah, you can call it a third force, you can call it foreign intervention, you can call it whatever you want. So you have this from the EFF, and then you have this upsurge of anti-racist, anti-white sentiment amongst the black people, and especially the more educated classes. It's always very interesting to me that the very poor black people, they are still working as domestic servants for instance in many white homes. They are still the person at the petrol filling station. Not like in America where you put your own petrol in. You have a person putting your petrol in South Africa into your car, gasoline. You call it gasoline. Eh?
Yes.
Those poor people, you don't find the rabid hatred that you find in the more educated classes of the black community. So I think it's to a certain extent what we've spoken about, the white liberals putting ideas into the new black educated class that actually is foreign to them. They it's not inbred that the black South African will hate the white South African or vice versa, but all these radical ideas are put into the mind of the more educated classes. So you have that, and like you had in the United States, also the protests at the universities. We had exactly the same in South Africa, with roads must fall, and then it was the fees must fall. So you had all the disturbances at the universities. Now. all these things are playing on another background. And that background is that we are facing local government elections now inside this year. It must still take place. The official date is now the 3rd of August. So this must take place in South Africa this year. But now we are sitting with a very peculiar problem in that our elections commission found itself as the losing party in a court case against the DA, the Democratic Alliance. That's the main opposition party at this time. Um, and that will most probably cause the elections maybe not to be able to take place in August. Now,
Yes.
this creates a constitutional problem because the Constitution says exactly this. It must happen in a certain period of time. So now you're facing a constitutional problem. The Constitutional Court actually must still give a finding to tomorrow or the day after relating to this. But you're sitting with this very serious problem now of the EFF saying, well, the ANC is actually running the election commission and they are trying to play games to stop us from gaining power on local government. So now you see the two black parties, the two big black parties showing the teeth to one another already on this key issue. But it goes much further. Some time ago, maybe the American listeners will be aware of this. There was this huge financial scandal. Now in South Africa, financial scandals going into millions and millions of dollars or rands. It's not something strange. It happens on a daily basis. But what made this specific scandal so very important in the whole political scene was that President Zuma's private residence in Natal was upgraded to the amount of about 250 million rand. I'm not sure how many dollars that would be, but it's a huge outlay.
Schalk, it was actually more than the
Yes,
money given to South Africa by Britain in aid in that same year. So he
yes.
spent more on his personal compound that year than was given in total aid to South Africa by the British.
Yes. We're speaking huge amounts that was spent on his private residence. Then President Zuma came out to say when the scandal hit the scene, he came out to say, but I won't pay back the money. For the very simple reason, most of these expenses were actually security related. You could give reasons at that stage, according to him, that were valid. But everybody realized that it wasn't valid. And that case ended up before our own public protector's office. Um, it's like an ombudsman person in South Africa who's supposed to, in constitutional terms, if something like that comes up, they must investigate that. And then the public protector came back during the early part of this year to say, but these upgrades were indeed illegal. They couldn't happen. And then the ANC was still fighting against this, and it ended up in court, and the court decided, the High Court of South Africa decided that the public protector was correct, and that Zuma could not have spent those expenses, and he was put on terms he's now supposed to pay back the money. But now the EFF has been running this whole thing about Nkandla. It's the name of the town that the house is built. They've been running this whole campaign for quite some years now of Mr. Zuma, you must pay back the money. And you can imagine yourself now, the public protector and the so-called old regime High Court of South Africa now coming out and saying, well, actually the EFF, you were right. You were right when you said Zuma couldn't have those expenses. So it was fat on the fire. So all of a sudden, now you have this huge pressure on President Zuma. He's clearly now in the wrong, and the EFF has really taken this whole thing to portray themselves now as the champions of ordinary people against this corrupt government. But now what's very strange, Malema comes out and say, actually the ANC is only the lackey of white capital in South Africa. So our problem is not the ANC, it's not even Zuma. We're going to take out the ANC and going to take out Zuma, but then we're going to get to our real enemy.
The whites.
And this is what he said directly. We're going to
Yes.
get our real enemy, who are the whites.
Mm.
Now, that's very scary. That's very scary. Um, Africa is known for coups. They are known for hostile takeovers of government, of civil war. So the moment that a strong party like the EFF, which obviously is funded and organized also from outside, starts to make noises like this, it really sends shivers down your spine. Especially if you're a very small minority. White people in South Africa is only 8% of the population. Especially if you're a very small minority and you don't have any means to defend yourself. And
Yes.
why do I say that? After 1994, the whole security mechanism of the state has been transformed, and white people have mostly been excluded from it. So you don't have a white army anymore or white police force. Those people are black people. Now, until I would say the beginning of this year, uh, it wasn't so scary because people saw the army as still to be
Their friend.
only an army.
Mm.
Yeah, there's nothing strange about it. It's the army. Yeah, it's black people in the army. Maybe they are very ineffectual. So the most criticism were in that line. But then something very strange happened when this whole thing of Mr. Zuma must now pay back the money and Zuma must resign. Something very strange happened. Inside our defense force, I don't know if any other country has this, but inside our defense force, we have a trade union. Our soldiers are unionized, which is a very strange phenomenon, but we have it. Like in South Africa, we can have very strange things. And when the pressure started building up on Zuma to resign, this trade union came out in so many words to say, but we support that Zuma must step down as president. Now imagine the United States Army tonight going to the press and making a formal press release to say, we oppose President Obama and he must step down and we will support anybody that's trying to take him out.
That
Just
is
imagine
one
yourself,
scary thought.
it's total chaos. It's total chaos. In actual fact, it's seditious. You can't do that. The army is supposed to defend the government of the day. Doesn't matter which party it is. So that was a prelude to something further that happened about a month later. Then the EFF came out to say, and they had the manifesto launch now, where they showed their manifesto, their election manifesto for August. They had a huge meeting at Orlando Stadium, huge soccer stadium. There was about 40 or 50,000 people attending, maybe even more, maybe 100,000. It's very difficult to say. But during the manifesto launch, Malema went ahead, the EFF's leader went ahead to say, but remember something now, most of the soldiers are members of the EFF also. So never mind that the fact that they are unionized and the union wants the president out, they are even also members of the opposition party, which is calling for Zuma to step down and for the possibility of taking over. Um, and that in itself, those things, it starts to indicate a very serious problem because now the government doesn't have control over its army anymore. This morning I had a discussion on South African radio where everybody, all the so-called experts were saying, no, but the army is safe. Don't worry. As a South African citizen, I'm very worried tonight because all the signs are there that the army cannot be trusted politically anymore to be on the side of the government, which is now the lesser of two evils. And that's a very scary scenario for everybody.
But then, Schalk, that leads us into being like the rest of Africa, where the army joins what becomes the winning side, simply by
Yes.
force of arms. And it's happened all over Africa, and it's never led to anything good for the people, ever.
No, it hasn't. Like in Central America and South America, right through Africa, you had these coups, these military coups and juntas and dictators coming to power from the army. And yeah, it's been a trail of total destruction, top to bottom. The whole sub-Saharan Africa, even North Africa, north of the Sahara Desert, uh, everywhere you've had this at some point in time, and it's totally destructive. Bear in mind now that South Africa's economy is also taking a huge beating at this stage. Our rand dropped in value against the dollar. There were a host of factors that caused that, but one of them was because of the crisis of Zuma and the presidency and these things. So the rand dropped. Our monetary value dropped tremendously in comparison, for instance, to the dollar and the pound. So that in itself caused a huge problem because we import most of our fuel and our oil. That's one of the things. We're also sitting with the greatest drought in South Africa in the last 80, maybe 100 years. So much so that we it's common knowledge by this time that we're going to have food shortages the first time in the history of South Africa, maybe by June, July.
And there are
Now,
entire towns without water for
there's
weeks on
entire
end.
towns. Yes, yes. North of me is a whole town of about 50,000 people. They receive formal notice now that by the 18th of May, there's literally no water left. So that's the drought scenario. And we can't produce the amount of foodstuffs that we would usually produce. And remember, in the southern hemisphere, we're now going into winter, and winter is dry in South Africa. There's no rain in South Africa in winter. You can't produce crops. And if it didn't rain in the summers, cattle farming, sheep farming, all these things are affected because there's no feed for the cattle and the sheep. So it's all these crisis factors all of a sudden becoming a perfect storm. And I'm very skeptical of what's going to happen in 3 or 4 months time from now. Uh, you also find that the EFF being a party now in parliament, they have a lot of parliamentarians. On more than one occasion, even this afternoon, they disrupted the parliamentary proceedings to such an extent that they had to be put out of the parliament, the meeting itself by force. Now these things are all indicators that they are just simply spoiling for a fight with the ANC now. If something happens, let's put a scenario there. Let's say in one of these brawls in Parliament, a security guard loses his temper and he shoots one of those EFF
Oh,
parliamentarians.
oh.
That in itself can be the spark that ignites this whole thing.
And yet, Julius Malema appears to be spoiling for that fight because he said on Al Jazeera, and then he said it again at another meeting, that we will ask the ANC at the barrel of a
Yes,
gun.
yes. Yes, he said it in so many words. He went on worldwide TV through the news channel Al Jazeera, and on Al Jazeera he said it in so many words. We will oust if the government keeps on and he tries to put. Now I'm not speaking good of the government. I criticize the ANC government because it's the most corrupt thing that could ever happen in South Africa. But it's still the government of the day. And what he said in so many words on worldwide television, he said that if the ANC keeps on putting pressure on us, then we will remove it, and even through the barrel of a gun.
And
Now
then the
that's
interviewer asked him again, he said, so that to be sure that nothing is taken out of context, you said,
yes,
and he repeated it and he said, yes, absolutely, that's what he means. So there's no
that's what
doubt
he
about
means.
his meaning or the context of that statement.
Exactly. Exactly, because sometimes politicians are in the habit of saying no, but the media quoted me incorrectly, and you're quite right. The journalist, the reporter asked him specifically, "Is that what you mean?" And he confirmed,
Mm.
"Yes, that is
Mm.
what I mean. We will remove this government by the barrel of a gun." Now, yes, yes. Now something very interesting also flowing from this. South Africa has this history because of its marginalized population, whites and blacks and different tribes and so on. Every time you have a regime change, you will find that the people opposing that all of a sudden become traitors.
Yes.
So when the Nationalist Party came to power many years ago, the ANC was outlawed and SACP was outlawed, and Nelson Mandela and all those so-called freedom fighters, and I call them so-called freedom fighters because to me they were terrorists, but
Yes.
to the black population in South Africa they were freedom fighters. Those people were tried for high treason and sedition and those kinds of crimes, and they were sentenced to prison for that. Then 1994 came, and during the early years of the new regime, there were quite a few of the more far right Afrikaner and Boer groups. One day we must speak about this whole thing of the terminology of what Afrikaner or Boer or white person in South
Yes.
Africa is.
Yes.
But but for now, many of those very far right wing groups planned and plotted to get rid of the black government. They wanted to re-establish white rule,
Was
and then
this
all of a
led
sudden,
by Eugene Terra Blanche?
yeah, amongst others, maybe some of your listeners will still remember Eugene Treblanche.
Yeah.
Uh, that was in the very early years of the new government. Then later on, Mr. De Blanche, he was actually sentenced to prison, and that basically ended his political career. But from those far right organizations, even today, you have a whole host of little splinter groups, and many of those groups actually plotted to put a white government in place again, or maybe re-establish the Boer republics or whatever. I'm not criticizing those people. I'm speaking as a conservative Afrikaner. So in principle, I don't have a problem um, in self-determination for
Mm.
Afrikaner people
Mm.
and so forth. But for the government of the day, those people were regarded then as terrorists. And there were two specific cases. The one was called the so-called Boerenmag, that literally means Boer force. And what happened there was an actual plot. They even planted bombs and so forth. They ordered ammunition and guns, pretty much like your militia in United States, and that type of a scenario. And those people were arrested, and they were imprisoned on charges of high treason and sedition and all these.
The same
That,
as
that was
Nelson Mandela. The same.
same as Nelson Mandela way back. Um, some years later, there was another incident. It was called the Mangaung Four. What basically happened there was that they arrested four so-called right-wingers. They were called right-wingers. Many people say it would trump up charges against them for allegedly plotting to actually get rid of Zuma and his government to have an assassination attempt
Mm.
against him. And those people were also sent to prison for these same type of crimes, high treason, sedition. Now, let's fast forward until this last week when Malema went so far as to say we will remove Zuma and we will remove the ANC by the barrel of a gun. Very shortly after that, already you heard moans and groans from the ANC, from the ruling party to say, but you can't say these things. If you say these things, it's actually high treason. And about 2 or 3 days after the Al Jazeera interview, formal criminal charges were actually laid against Julius Malema in his person and the EFF as an organization. Formal criminal charges of high treason and sedition has been laid against him. Now, in South Africa, maybe it's the same in the US. What will happen is that those charges will now be investigated by the South African police force, and that docket, with all the evidence, the evidentiary material, will be handed over to the National Prosecuting Authority. In America, you will call it the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Mm-hmm.
And they will then decide on the evidence before them whether they're going to prosecute him or not. So there's still a little bit of time that must lapse now for the police to finalize the investigations and all these things. But the long and the short is, in technical terms, Julius Malema has now been charged with high treason. In South Africa, high treason is seen under our Criminal Prosecutions Act. There's a certain schedule, it's called Schedule 6 to the Act. And in terms of Schedule 6, a charge of high treason means that that person must be arrested and brought before court in custody. And then the court must decide whether he can be granted bail or not. And now, citing all the case law, everything that went before, the Boerenmag and the Mangaung 4, and the so-called freedom fighters of the ANC all those years back, the legal precedent shows that usually a person will not be granted bail. If the charge of high treason is against you, you will not be granted bail. You will stay in custody until such time that the case is finalized. So in practical terms, this means that if the NPA decides tonight that they will prosecute Julius Malema for high treason, he will be arrested tomorrow and he will most probably stay in prison until the finalization of the case, which can be years to come. After this news became evident, Julius Malema then actually went so far as to say, but try me. Come and arrest me and see what will happen.
He did.
So it now goes further. He's now even challenging the authority of the state, which in itself is also criminal. So from a legal standpoint, this now the law runs into the politics now, but we're sitting with quite a crisis because somebody at the NPA must now make a decision to say yes. We're going to prosecute Julius Malema, which will inevitably mean that he will be arrested. Or somebody must make the determination we are not going to prosecute Malema. But then it opens a can of worms for them. Because then what happens to the Boerenmag, who's still sitting in prison? And what's happening to the Mangaung 4, who's still sitting in prison? Then they must be released. Because why is the state not prosecuting high treason then fairly? So it's a very strange dynamic that we've ended up with now.
I'm absolutely stunned because whoever has to make that decision, it's a no-win situation either way.
Yes, it's a no-win situation either way. Look, for the right-wing people and the more conservative people in South Africa, if they decline to prosecute now, it means that most probably there will now be appeals processes and so forth for the people sitting in prison. But that's not the point. The point is here that we're facing the possibility of civil war because of the constitutional and the legal still the supremacy of law in South Africa. It's a very huge contradiction, but that is what we are actually now sitting in with Julius Malema. And the problem is you're going to have, if there is a civil war, this is the scenario that I want to bring across to the American listener. If you're going to sit with a civil war between the Black EFF and the Black ANC, by the virtue of white people being a marginalized, small 8% minority in South Africa, we're also going to stand in the middle of that firefight.
Absolutely.
And we don't have any means to protect ourselves.
Schalk,
we don't have
because
means.
You are the common enemy.
Yes.
From both sides. From the ANC side, they're using as a run-up to the elections everything anti-white. From the economic freedom fighters side, they're using the same thing. Yes, we're coming to get Zuma, but after that, the whites. And yes. he, as you say, is going to take everything from the whites because he
Yes.
said as well, you cannot steal from a white person because you are simply taking back what was yours in the first place. So,
Yes.
no matter what, the common enemy is the whites. And as you say,
Yes.
there are so few of you, and sorry, I interrupted, but it's important for
No,
people to
it's fine,
understand
Karen.
that from both sides, the white is the common enemy. It's what unites these disparate tribes who would, by nature, be warring with each other. It unites them against a common enemy, the white people. If the whites were taken out of the equation, they would probably go back to fighting with each other. So it is to everybody's advantage, except the whites, to keep the whites the enemy. Now, as you were saying, you don't have any defense. You cannot defend yourselves.
Yes, even in South Africa, and I always say if the American people wants to see what will happen to them under a Democrat or liberal government,
Mm.
if Hillary Clinton is Bernie Sanders, for
Oh,
goodness sake,
oh,
if they choose that guy as a president, but Hillary also. If you look at South Africa today, you're going to see what America will look like in 10 years' time.
yes.
Gun control, the gun control laws that Obama's administration is trying to force through, those gun control laws have already been experimented with in South Africa. The average citizen in South Africa, doesn't matter if he's black or white, can't by law own more than, for instance, one handgun or one shotgun.
And even
You can
that is
own
not easy to get.
exactly. It's a whole licensing process. In America, you only have background checks. In South Africa, it's virtually impossible to simply own a firearm.
Mm.
And if you own them, you are even limited on what you can own and the amount of it. So those laws are already in place in South Africa. But the whole narrative also always of the anti-gun lobby is, yeah, but if you take the legal guns away from the legal gun owners, then automatically you will stop the criminals from
Yes,
obtaining guns.
yes.
Now in South Africa, the exact opposite has happened after the new gun laws came into effect, and you can see the crime trends. I don't have to tell it to the American listener. He can go and look it up for himself on Google or wherever. You will see that violent crime has escalated. It has escalated to a point that the police can't keep any order anymore in certain areas, despite the fact that we are sitting with these extremely tight gun control laws. But I'm not speaking now on behalf of the NRA. I hope they will give me a little bit of money somewhere in the future. But I'm not speaking now
They
as a
paid
pro
you,
gun lobbyist
admit.
now. I'm
Admit.
simply speaking from experience of seeing these things now happening firsthand. It's not theoretical. It's not. It can happen. These things have already happened in South Africa. It's not an imagined threat. It's an actual day-to-day threat that we are sitting with. So now you sit with the legal firearm owners, the citizens of South Africa, not being in a position to actually defend themselves against the superior arms of the army or the police or these institutions. So the white people can't defend themselves. It's as simple as that. And you're it's quite true what you're saying, that the ANC themselves are running an extremely anti-white racial-based campaign at this stage. We have the black economic empowerment laws in South Africa, basically barring white people from entering the economy.
Yes.
You have so-called employment equity laws. Now, in America, your affirmative action laws and legislation revolves around empowering minorities. In South Africa, our affirmative action laws is about disempowering minorities.
Yes.
Our law actually states that if you're a minority, you're not supposed to get a job because the majority must get a job. The workplace must reflect the racial mix up makeup of the population. And all those things are projected against the white minority. All these legislation, you can try and paint them as nicely as possible, but in effect, in practice, it means that white people are being barred from the economy and from the workplace. Right. Um, you have sporting quotas.
Oh my
Now,
goodness.
uh,
Oh,
what happened? Now, a week ago, the Minister of Sports. Now, imagine yourself being an American sitting in this scenario now. Your Minister of Sports coming out to say, but American football and baseball, the big sporting codes in your country, can from now on, by sanction of the state, not have any international events coming to America because you have not complied with racial laws. Now, this may seem like fantasy. This is what happened last week in South Africa. The Minister of Sport, Mr. Fikile Mbalula, came out to say cricket, rugby, athletics. I'm not sure about the fourth one, netball. Netball. Those four sporting codes are still dominated mostly by white people, and because they have not transformed to reflect the population of South Africa, these sporting codes can now not host any international events anymore. That is how far this racialization of South Africa has gone. That is how far it's gone. So we can't a white boy in South Africa can't imagine himself anymore to be in the Springbok team, the national team in 10 years time from now, because he's white. He's going to be barred from reaching the highest level in his sporting code because of his race. This is
yeah.
directly the result of the policies of the ANC. So their whole ideology is also it's supposed to be multicultural, but it's actually anti-white. It boils down in practice to being anti-white. It's as simple as that.
But in practice, the
Yes,
EFF is the ANC on steroids.
yes, yes. Like I said, through the years, I think the ANC came to realize, well, there's two key factors you must remember here. Firstly, because communism doesn't work, many of the policies of the ANC simply imploded on them, and excuse me, I think at one stage they started to come to the realization that they will have to have a more capitalist economy. So that on the one hand it was simply that their policies did not work. On the other hand, because South Africa is still an extremely economically rich country, very early on, the party cadres of the ANC started to realize that they could make a huge amount of money if they started climbing into the capitalist system.
Mm.
So you actually had Mr. Ramaphosa, for instance, who's now the vice president of the ANC. Technically, he's supposed to succeed Zuma. It's still very difficult to say if that's going to happen. But Mr. Ramaphosa was a trade unionist. He was in the trade unions, and he climbed into the then white economy, the capitalist economy many years ago. And he's today he's a billionaire.
Yes.
And a guy like Patrice Motsepe, same thing. He also came from an ANC party political communist ideology, and he's once again he's one of the richest men on the continent of Africa. Africa today is one of the richest men in the world. So those two key things. Firstly, they realize communism is not going to work, and secondly, they turned a quick buck on the whole thing through their economic empowerment laws.
Yeah.
Tempered the ANC from where it was a socialist organization 30 years ago, a communist, a Marxist ideology underlying its economic policies, to where today it's basically a free market type of situation. Um, but the EFF, as I said, they took those very old ways of thinking, hardline socialist, the things that didn't work in Eastern Europe, the things that didn't work in Russia, They took those policies and they rebranded it itself now as supposedly to bring economic freedom to the black masses of South Africa. So yes, the EFF is basically an ANC on very, very strong steroids,
Mm, mm.
and very radical. And what's scary about the EFF, in their they believe in their radicalism. So it's not only rhetoric. Sometimes you will find that politicians say the weirdest things, but it's simply to garner attention and all those things. Now, of course, the EFF is also making a huge amount of noise just simply to put itself into the political landscape. But here's the but: whatever Malema and the EFF sets out to do, they accomplish. If they say we will do something, they do it because they believe in their own radical policies. And that is what makes them so extremely dangerous in this whole political landscape of South Africa.
And unfortunately, the education system, as we've spoken about a little before, reinforces that to the born frees, as they're called. They have been educated into believing that the socialist system is the only way for the future of the world.
Yes, that's true. If you go and read the books that even my children must learn from now, you end up with a very strange version of what happened in the past. Um, One of the key things, the key notes of the EFF is this thing of the white man must give back the land to the black man.
Yes,
Now, okay,
yes,
here's the problem with this whole narrative. Afrikaners, the Afrikaner nation, the Boer nation started way back in 1652. That is when our founding fathers, the same as the Americans, landed in Africa. When we landed in Africa, there were no black people where we landed. There were Khoisan people, and they're basically a brownish. It's a totally different race from the Bantu people who are the black people, the Nguni people, and the Sotho people these days. So they were living there as nomads, scattered all over the place. But there were no black people living in the areas that were, in the first place, settled by the white colonists. So you had about 200 years of white colonization into the interior of South Africa before the first time we met the black tribes on the Fish River and the Kai River. That's
yes,
the
and they
first time.
certainly didn't have cities and towns. Even
They
those that
didn't
we
have
met
cities
were
and
still
towns.
nomadic.
That was the first time. That was why there were 11 border wars during the history of the Cape Colony on the far eastern side of the Cape Colony, where the white colonists, for the first time, came into contact with the black colonists, moving in from the north and the east. You will also find the big Drakensberg mountain lying basically across central South Africa. It goes up into the Witwatersrand and the Lebombo mountains and so forth. You will find that the black tribes very seldomly settled west of that escarpment for the very simple reason they were mostly cattle farmers and goat farmers. They were pastoral people. West of the Drakensberg, that area of South Africa is very arid and
Mm,
dry.
mm.
So the black people never settled there because they couldn't raise their cattle there. The white people settled there. That is where the Free State, for instance, it is still called today, the province is still called the Free State. That is where
Yes.
the Boers went, the Boer people went during the Great Tech. Um, and they established a state where nothing else existed. It was barren, virgin country. There was nothing. Nobody lived there. That is where they built their Boer republics. It was only because of the industrialization of South Africa in the next century, in the 20th century, that you had huge amount of black people streaming into the western part of South Africa. But now you're sitting with this narrative that the freeborns are being told at school and in the media and all these. that white people basically came to Africa. They stole all the land from the people in the black people who were already living there in South Africa, and all the black people were slaves. Now that literally never happened.
Mm.
Slavery in South Africa. The slaves were imported from Malaysia and from India and from Indonesia. Why? Because at that stage, the Dutch were still the colonial masters of the Cape Colony, which was a white colony. And the people that they imported were from the Dutch East Indias. So the slaves in South Africa were people of Malay and Indonesian descent, and they still live in South Africa in the Malay quarters in the Cape. Those people can trace their lineage directly back to Indonesia, not even the rest of Africa. So you didn't have the American example where you had North and West Africa and Negro slaves being caught there and taken to the American continent. Um, the people imported as slaves into South Africa were people of Eastern descent.
Yeah, they weren't
Black,
even Africans.
they weren't Africans. Africans, black Africans, were never enslaved during any stage, any point in time in South Africa. Black people did have black slaves. That's a fact. But white people never enslaved black people in South Africa. That never happened. And the American listener can go and fact check me on that. Um, it is ludicrous. It never happened. You rather found the scenario of these huge wars between the British and the Xhosa people, later on the British and the Zulus, the Anglo-Zulu War and incidents like that. But it was never a case of black people being enslaved. But remember, that is now the narrative, and it's a narrative that was borrowed from America and from certain other parts of Africa. That's now being infused into the education system of South Africa and the popular culture in South Africa.
And
So
accepted
black
as
person will
fact.
come. Yes,
Accepted as fact.
that that
This is
type
a
of
good place to
fabrication.
stop. We're coming up to an ad break. We will be back in
Okay.
a few minutes and we will carry on right from the slave trade or so called slavery of the black South Africans. You're listening to Radio Free South Africa with your host Karen Smith and our guest tonight, Schalk van Merwe from South Africa. Before the break, we were talking about the stories that are spread to our children in South Africa, and especially to the young black people, that the whites are the enemy and the blacks were the slaves, and we built South Africa on their backs. So it is perfectly logical for them to take the land back from the whites. Welcome back, Schalk.
Thank you, Karen.
So you were saying that this story now, that land redistribution is perfectly okay because we stole it, and the unfortunately for us, the younger black population firmly believing that because that's what they've been taught.
Yes, that's a fact, and you must remember that this is not only a South African phenomenon.
No.
We've seen Zimbabwe for instance the last 15 to 20 years. Exactly the same happened in Zimbabwe. You also found it in Mozambique, earlier on in Angola, in the Congo, everywhere that you had large white populations. You basically found that it became a political tool of the regime taking over. They would demonize the white population, and then they will start with the so-called redistribution of land, which was actually just simply taking land away from the white population, and that usually then escalates into taking over businesses and literally taking possessions and houses and you name it, everything. So it's not only in South Africa that we've seen this, and it's because we're sitting with the historical precedent. That is what's causing the discomfort about amongst white South Africans, because we know it could happen because it has happened already. In South Africa, it's been very structurally formalized. What happened in South Africa was that from word go, there were these black empowerment laws that came in, very technical laws, making it very difficult for businesses, for instance, when they were tendering for the mine for procurement, supplying services, supplying goods. They must comply with these laws, otherwise they can't tender, things like that. So through laws, it became very difficult for white businesses just simply to go on. And those laws, many people thought that there would be a so-called sunset clause at one stage, and we would stop with black empowerment. But you've actually seen an increase
Yes.
in the legislation and the intensification of the regulations relating to that. Um, so it's already formalized in practice. But what the EFF, their way of thinking, what makes them different from the ANC, where the ANC is doing it as so-called or supposedly within the confines of the constitution and the law, the EFF is saying, but it's taking too long. This thing is not working. We want to not even distribute. They're speaking of we want to misappropriate disappropriate land now without any compensation. We want to disappropriate the nationalized mines and banks and everything now without any compensation. So it's a key difference between the ANC, who's doing it much more formalized through law, versus the EFF, which is it's rabid, it's wild, in the way that it wants to achieve these objectives.
And now you sit with Zimbabwe, who I assume is facing the same drought situation as South Africa. They, who
Yes,
used to be the breadbasket of Africa, are now going with their begging bowl to the Western nations and saying, look, our people are starving. We ate rats in December. We need food. We need help. And they're getting it. But so, although that example is right there as our neighbor, almost the same country, because we've always been so closely aligned with what was Rhodesia. Now,
yes, yes.
somehow Julius Malema does not see that example as what is going to happen to South Africa. He doesn't see it.
Exactly. Neither the ANC, but Malema specifically. Malema, early on when he was still even with the ANC Youth League, and later on when he founded the EFF, he visited Robert Mugabe, and he was seen with Robert Mugabe many times, and he idealizes Robert Mugabe as this you or this great African liberator, and he holds him as an example of how everything in South Africa is supposed to be to be done. But you're quite true. Once again, all these things theoretically maybe make sense to him, but in practical terms, here's what's left of the country of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, you're quite right, was seen at one time as the breadbasket of at least Southern Africa.
Yeah.
Um, you have an extremely fertile country in Zimbabwe. It was the old Southern Rhodesia. It's very interesting to go and see how that came to be. You had Bechuana land, which is today Botswana, and then Cecil John Rhodes, the great British imperialist. He claimed what is today Zimbabwe and also Malawi to the north and Zambia. He claimed those areas of Africa as his own actual domain.
Yes.
And he literally went and he went past a very dry and arid Bechuana land, and he took the very fertile area, what was later called Rhodesia and today is Zimbabwe. Uh, it's an extremely wealthy, rich nation in natural resources. It's very fertile, as I said. They have a huge amount of rainfall, which is not very common in many parts of Africa. Um, they have huge mineral resources. So it was actually supposed to be an extremely highly developed and successful country in Africa. But then during the 70s, Ian Smith and the white government came to power there. They had the Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI, but they were sanctioned by the outside world. And eventually, in the early 80s, the black government of Robert Mugabe took over. His party is called the ZANU PF. And they've ruled Zimbabwe ever since. And they've basically ruled Zimbabwe as a personal fiefdom of where Robert Mugabe and his party actually rule the country like kings and nobles. They are a law unto themselves. And in those in that 2 or 3 decades that's passed, Zimbabwe has become an extremely poor country. Um, they took away most of the white farmland. They took away from the commercial white farmers. Those lands are now basically lying arid, and it's basically jungle again,
Yes.
where it used to have been very fertile farmland. Tobacco, for instance, Zimbabwe was a huge exporter of the finest tobacco in the world. Um, there's a little bit of an upsurge of smaller scale tobacco farmers, black tobacco farmers, but that market has basically disappeared. Foodstuffs has basically disappeared. They are sitting at the point where it's become so critical that they are famine in certain areas of Zimbabwe. They eat rats. You're quite right. There were a few media reports not very long ago of showing pictures of Zimbabweans actually catching rats to eat. That is how impoverished the black population under a black government has become in Zimbabwe. But for Julius Malema, that is still the ideal. That is where he wants to take South Africa. And now the parallels between the two countries are very similar, but there's also huge differences. South Africa is economically and technologically still a huge powerhouse in Africa. In years gone by under the apartheid regime and even before that, it was the richest country in the southern hemisphere, never mind in Africa. We had an army that was basically, it was the fourth most powerful army at one stage in the world. That is where we came from. So it's different to Zimbabwe because it's much bigger than Zimbabwe. The scale of South Africa is just simply incomparable to Zimbabwe.
Mm.
So it will be more difficult, of course, it will be more difficult for either the ANC or the EFF to make South Africa a second Zimbabwe. You also have a much bigger white population. The Rhodesians were never more than about 250,000 in number. In South Africa, we still have about 4.5 million white people. You have about 3 million Indian people. You have about 5 million colored people being of mixed descent, these Malay people that I spoke about. So there's big differences. But for Malema, that is still what is being idolized. That is what he wants in South Africa. And it's a very scary scenario. You must remember something else. With the terrible economic downturn in Zimbabwe, you had streams of black Zimbabweans coming
To
into
South
South
Africa.
Africa.
Yeah.
Some sources say thousands, some sources say millions. Long and short is there's a huge number of Zimbabweans that fled south because of what was going on in Zimbabwe. They are not formally refugees. They don't live in refugee camps, for instance, like you would have in the Middle East or Ethiopia or places. But huge amounts came into South Africa. But also the displaced white population. simply fled south to South Africa. Some went overseas to Britain and Australia. But most of those displaced white people came to South Africa. Here's the problem for white South Africans. Where do we go?
Yes.
Uh, we can't return. How do you resettle 4.5 million people all of a sudden back to Europe, for instance?
You
How do you do
can't.
that?
They don't speak
It's
the
impossible.
language. They don't speak the language. They don't have those customs and uh, they don't belong. They don't belong. They're African.
Exactly. I can't see myself as a European. Many Afrikaners would immigrate overseas, and after 4, 5, or 6 years or a decade, they come back because they are not Europeans anymore. They are not Australians. They are not Americans. They are Africans. They are Afrikaner. The name says it all. We're people of Africa. We've been in South Africa longer than, for instance, the Zulu nation has existed.
Yes.
Um, we've been in South Africa for centuries, so it's impossible to simply displace 4.5 million people back to Europe. You can't do that. So the key question for us is if the ANC goes totally crazy now and even become harsher in their black empowerment laws and these forth, or the EFF comes to power, where must we go? Now, there's one of two scenarios. They hate you because you are a white person. This has become very evident that even the so-called liberal white universities, UCT, for instance, University of Cape Town, was one of the most liberal anti-apartheid institutions in South Africa in those days. UCT was one of the first universities that was basically raised by the Fees Must Fall campaign of black
Yes.
students.
Yes.
They flip and burnt the whole some hostels. They even burnt out. They burnt the paintings hanging on the walls of the supposedly liberal white institution of the University of Cape Town. Also Witwatersrand, also Rhodes University, etc. So in other words, it's not about your political view. You can't integrate into the new order if Malema comes into power because you are white and they
Yes.
hate you because of your skin color.
Yes.
Politics doesn't matter. So what happens to you? There's one of two scenarios. Either in some miraculous way we can move somewhere else, which is totally impractical. You can't. Or inside South Africa, we must start to consolidate and claim self-determination in certain areas. That's basically the only options we have left. A huge percentage of whites still live with this fantasy that if they vote for the Democratic Alliance, it will come to power at some stage and it will be a more a fair dispensation, etc. They are still a huge number. The majority of white people still believe it can be done. But the realists have come to the conclusion very long ago that the system has failed already. We're sitting with the same government, the same ANC failed government that basically bankrupted the country, and the black population is still voting for it to the tune of 65% of the electorate.
Yeah.
So by democratic means, we're not going to effect a change to a more viable setup under for instance, the Democratic Alliance. The Democratic Alliance itself started out as a white liberal party many years ago, and it changed itself to where it's now positioned as a social democratic black party. For
Yes.
the very simple reason, if they don't have enough black voters, they can never displace the ANC. So they had to go to that market and make themselves acceptable to the black electorate by promising exactly the same, also black empowerment. They also promise so-called redistribution of land to the extent that after their manifesto launch a week or 2 weeks ago, the ANC came out to say, but all that the DA did is that they repackaged our policies and made it their own. The ANC is saying this of the main opposition party. Now imagine if the Democrats today come out and say, no, 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 but we don't understand what the Republicans are doing. They've simply taken our policies and they made it themselves. But that's the scenario we are facing politically. We can never again take control of the country. So we must start to think alternatively of how do we solve this problem coming our way, and it's coming our way. It's not
And
going to stop.
fast, Skulk. That's what's frightening me, is that um, most things that changed in South Africa happened relatively slowly. You know, like the way you did your house. You first put burglar bars on, and then you put security gates on, and then you put an
Yes,
alarm system in, and then you put up the 8 foot wall, and then you put electric wire on top of the wall. You know, it happened slowly. So you had time to acclimatize to the changes, and you didn't really notice them. Well, everything else in South Africa has happened that way. It's been a big change, but slow steps, baby steps that you got
yes,
used to it and just accepted it as a way of life. But now, in the last 8, 12 months, things seem to have escalated and hurried up to a degree that people are starting to notice now. It's not, you don't have time to acclimatize to one change before the next one steps in. It's happening so fast, and people are seeing that, wow, we really don't have a future here. What are we going to do? But I think if we'd have seen that in 1994, we might have been able to establish ourselves another way. But because we couldn't stand together and fight this at that time, we are now under extreme pressure to find an alternative. And I don't know that the ANC is going to allow you to do that in time for you to establish yourselves and become a viable nation of your own.
yes. It's a serious practical problem, and you must remember that the white people in South Africa in general and Afrikaner people in particular are very adaptable people. We have to be adaptable because we live in Africa. It's a harsh environment.
Mm-hmm.
You must adapt or you die.
Mm-hmm.
P.W. Botha in his famous speech in the 80s said, "Adapt or die." That's a long and a short. So we adapted. You're quite right. It's very slow, and we adapted and we adapted. But the fact of the matter is that 25 years has now lapsed since the dawn of the new South Africa, and everything has come up to this crisis point.
Mm-hmm.
It was always going to come to that point. People saw that already 25 years ago. But unfortunately, not enough people saw it 25 years ago.
Yeah.
People sat with this idea of a rainbow nation and fairness for everybody, and all the races will be accommodated, and all these things that I think the majority of South Africans actually believed in at one stage. But we once again sitting with the practicalities.
Yes.
You can always have culturalism in theory, but how do you put it in practice? And that is why I say, if the Americans look at us now and the Europeans, they see how they're going to look in 10 years from now, because the practical problem was that even despite all the reconciliation and all the best measures of everybody in South Africa, we still today a black nation, a brown nation, an Indian nation, and a white nation. We are still that, and
Yes.
it's also not going to change. It's always going to be like that.
But yet,
Um,
Skulk, is it
but
not
but
natural for people to self-segregate? I mean, you see it in the animal world. You don't see different breeds, different animals living in harmony together as a matter of course. Um, you also, to a lesser degree, see it in the plant world. So why is it then considered so unnatural in the human world that one wants to live with the same kind of people?
mm, yeah, and Karen, never mind genetics or even the natural world. Multiculturalism is contradictory to the lessons of history. Now, why
Yes.
do I say this? We can have a whole program about this. If you go and you look at the great civilizations of the world, the Egyptians and the Persians, later on the Greeks, the Hellenic times, after them the Romans, you will find that under those empires, Genghis Khan, for instance, he's also a very good example of those. Under those big civilizations, the great civilizations, you had the opposite of multiculturalism. You had
Yes.
the areas taken over. Those people, the princes still remained the princes of those areas, and the kings, the nations themselves became or their allegiance was to the empire, but they still remained separate nations and races and tribes on their own.
Yes.
That is what history teaches us. If you give that space to different tribes and nations, even within a big empire, that is how you build civilization. The opposite is true. The moment that you try to integrate, force different people to, and it's not even a white black thing. You can see this. Asia is a very good example.
Yes.
Malaysia, for instance, where you have people of Arab descent, you have people of Malay descent, of Indonesian descent, of Chinese descent. They are also still groups on their own. A so-called homogeneous society like Japan, you still have in the northern part of Japan, it's a separate type of people living there than the people of the two-thirds to the south of it. Um, it's natural, like you say, but it's also historic. History teaches you that you can't force people to integrate. The moment that you do that, you end up with a huge amount of conflict. Um, so the only way of getting to a peaceful place where you try to integrate races is if one of the races simply disappears. And
Yes.
this seems to be the program that's now being run in South Africa for races literally to disappear. Um, a lot is being said in South Africa about white genocide. It's a very controversial topic. The mainstream media and the mainstream, even white people, would disagree and say, but there's not a white genocide going on in South Africa. But you see a very strange phenomena already taking place in South Africa. The changing of place names and the names of
Yes.
towns.
Yes.
Uh, you have towns that were established by white people hundreds of years ago. And then the name is simply changed now to an African name. Now, it may seem superficial, but what is actually happening? You're actually extinguishing the footprint of that population totally because you can't even name the place connecting to the
Mm.
original people. And the names of places. Our language, Afrikaans. Afrikaans is under barrage at every level of society at this point in time. In universities, in civil society, in civil service, Afrikaans as a language has been marginalized and is now simply um, set aside and literally it's extinguished.
Yes.
So now you have place names and the physical locations of people, you have their language, you see where this is now going. And this is not conspiracy theory. We're experiencing it firsthand.
Well, one of the
Coupled with
things,
that,
those are both signs of a genocide. And the other
yes,
one is being a group of people being vilified, dehumanized, which is
yes,
exactly what has happened with the Afrikaner, white South African. They
yes,
are dehumanized. They are not considered human beings. You're called every rude name under the sun, but not people.
yes,
Not people.
yes,
You're cockroaches.
yes. So you're sitting with those two things that are highlighted now. You're sitting with Afrikaner and the white population being forced out of the economy even.
Mm,
Literally forced off the land, literally forced out of their businesses. because this is where it's going. The Minister of Labour came out earlier last week with these employment equity laws and the reports coming out to say that if companies don't comply within 6 months to have most of their managers, their management as black people, the government will take action against them. Now, in the laws, there are actually penal codes put into the laws that say you can actually go to prison if you don't comply with the law, or you can get a very stiff fine. So you're sitting with an extinguishing of everything relating to this culture. Never mind if it's a white culture. Afrikaner culture is disappearing because the government is simply smoldering it and smothering it. It's
Yes.
it's literally disappearing. Um, so, as I said, it's very controversial to call it outright a genocide. But if you're sitting in South Africa and you're experiencing these things and you start to question what is going on now, and now you have people like the EFF and Malema actually coming so far as to say, if we're going to take out the existing government and then we're coming after you,
Yes.
what else can a white South African feel as that he's now is literally facing to be genocided from the face of the earth? What else can we expect at this stage? You must really be foolish if you cannot see the danger. You must really be foolish.
And yet, Schalk, there are still the white liberal people, especially the intelligentsia, who will take the side of the black, will denigrate the white people who see the danger, who will try and make a fool of you so that you're a conspiracy theorist or just a straight idiot. And yet, even people like Max Dupree, who is that infamous white journalist who
Yes.
never saw anything good in white people, even he is coming round to say, wow, he's written some articles recently that have quite shocked me. That he's critical of the ANC and critical of the state of affairs in South Africa. But I do feel that the white people who are still making money in South Africa will not or do not want to see the problems because it would interfere with their income.
Yeah, that's also true. As I said earlier, South Africa is still an economic powerhouse. It's still a tremendously rich country in South Africa. It's in Africa. It's very rich. So yes, of course you have a certain level of people, and I don't want to discriminate now because of the classes of people, but there are people that are definitely making money out of the system. That's a fact. We are sitting with a very strange phenomena in South Africa relating to our media. When you go back into the history of South Africa, you will see that the English speaking media was always more liberal,
Yeah.
but very critical of government. Now they are still very liberal and still very critical of government, and now they are accused by government of being racist.
Mm.
But they forget that the same English speaking media was very critical against the Afrikaner government. The Afrikaner media traditionally was very conservative and pro-Afrikaner. It was basically the mouthpiece of the old nationalist Afrikaner Nationalist Party and of the Afrikaner Broederbond. It's as simple as it's not. This is not conspiracy theory. These are facts. The Afrikaner Broederbond, it was basically a secret society amongst Afrikaners that for decades and decades basically had a stranglehold in favor of the Afrikaners. Later on, they became totally bastardized and didn't follow their own principles anymore. So they basically lost their position in the Afrikaner society. But that is where the Afrikaner media came from. In other words, it was very conservative and pro-Afrikaner nationalist.
Mm.
And then with the birth of the new South Africa, like our churches also, this same media became extremely reactionary to everything that went before. All of a sudden, nobody voted for the Nationalist Party and nobody supported apartheid.
Mm.
For a very simple reason, I think at that stage, the people in high places realized that if they didn't go with the program of the new government, they would have been out of work. So now you find that the Afrikaner media, the Afrikaans media, is extremely liberal and what is very strange, very anti-Afrikaner.
Mm.
Our own media is against us. It is reactionary against us because it doesn't want to be labeled as pro-apartheid or as racist. So unfortunately, like you say this journalist Max Dupree, Max Dupree is notorious for his extremely leftist view of things. He started a newspaper many years ago that was extremely critical about the Nationalist Party and Afrikaner society in general. And he's still regarded as a very extremely liberal Afrikaner. But even he came to a point where he could not deny anymore that the current system is simply collapsing around him. He can't deny it anymore. And you find it now increasingly from the white Afrikaans media that they can't deny it anymore. Their own readership is falling because people are saying to them, you are trying to tell us nonsense. We can't believe what you are writing. And it's that realization that's now starting to dawn. But Karen, I think it's too late. It's too
Yeah,
late.
yeah, so do I.
The the effect of this was that the average white person, because we were raised in this um, I would say protected world of the Afrikaner Broederbond and the Nationalist Party and everything around us. We believed as a nation, we believed our newspapers, and we believed what the man on the TV said to us.
Yes,
Exactly
yes.
the same as the Americans are doing today.
Yep,
Exactly the same.
yep.
And because of that, we've actually been neutered. We literally we've been demailed if you want
Mm,
to call it
mm.
that. We're not strong enough to stand up for our own rights anymore. And that's the tragic part of this whole thing. I think the average white person in his heart of hearts, he realizes we are in very, very deep trouble. But because of many years of mind games and the media telling us all these lies, people are just simply not in a position anymore to actually stand up and say we've had enough and we must effect a change in some way now.
I think it was you, Schalk, that said we were very bad at PR. We have never told our side of the story. We've always just sat back and let people tell the story for us. And so, in a lot of ways, it's our own fault. But on the other hand, as one of the things that I say so often, and people just look at me blankly, white South Africans are incredibly law abiding people. So they don't believe in standing up and making a noise. They don't believe in fighting authority. We don't, we may have an old background in that, but in recent history, in our lifetimes, we don't have a history of that. We don't have an example to follow. Um, Apart from our Boer leaders and the great heroes, we don't have modern day examples of people like Mandela, who was a terrible terrorist. We don't have somebody like that who stood up and showed us the way to fight for our rights and fight for ourselves. And so South Africans are still waiting for that leader to emerge and lead them to a better life, a safer life, or whatever. But we don't have them.
Yeah, no, that's a fact. You highlight something very, very interesting about Afrikaners, and now we can even speak about their culture and their religion. Um, on your program, we spoke about this thing of Afrikaners always trying to choose the peaceful way.
Yes.
We would rather climb in our ox wagons and trek into the distant interior of Africa before we fight the Xhosa people or the British
Mm.
people. We would rather give up part of our republic, the diamond fields of Kimberley, before we go to war against the British Empire. So the Afrikaner people, by its very nature, its culture, we are not belligerent. We
Mm.
don't like fighting. We
Mm.
don't like wars. We've never done that. There's also a religious aspect to this. You must remember that the Afrikaner people comes from very Calvinist stock. Now, in the United States, you have the Amish people. The Amish people, the way of the Amish is basically the same as what were our forefathers. We came to South Africa. The French Huguenots, for instance, came to South Africa because they didn't want to fight in the religious wars of Europe. So in other words, we are not people who like fighting. We are not um, we always pride ourselves. We are harde gat. Now
Mm.
that's a term in Afrikaans mean basically a heart behind. I don't want to use the rude word, but that's more a boast. We boast about being these hard tough guys and these rebels. But if you really look at the soul of the Afrikaner, we're a peaceful nation. We don't make war. We would rather step aside and be less than the other person
Mm.
and rather give him the opportunity. And this is also the other tragic part of the New South Africa. You will find that white people have done their utmost best to make the system work. Today in municipal local municipalities, you have basically all the black officials, and then you would find here and there a white official actually still doing all the work and handling all the pressure.
Mm.
And I'm not being racist when I say this. Even the black people in municipalities, um, they pride themselves on having a white person doing this or that or the following. So it's not even something strange in South Africa. So you have the Afrikaner people really from their side, because this is how we were raised. We always try to adapt. We always try to be less and see a way around the thing. And that maybe is going to be our downfall in the end. We
Yeah.
we we gave so much away that we simply can't take it back. It's impossible. When the new South Africa came, you must remember that South Africa, that Afrikaners gave away all their power.
Yes.
They gave away their economic power. They gave away their political power, their military. We had this magnificent army. We gave all that up because we wanted what? Peace.
Yeah.
And that is maybe our biggest downfall. That is maybe in the final analysis, that's the thing that's going to kill us off, because we always try to make peace rather than make war.
And yet it seems to me that there, unless some huge miracle occurs worldwide, not only in South Africa, um, that is the only outcome that I can see coming, is a civil war for you people in South Africa, because the EFF is determined, absolutely determined, that that's what it's going to come to. And as you said, you can't defend yourselves. You are very few. You are scattered. Um, I I really, really fear it, and I don't know who or what is going to happen to keep you safe, or to make a plan, or to. I know that there are so many splinter groups trying to find another way, but the government is equally determined not to sit down at the table and help you find another way.
I think, and here we must be very realistic. The government doesn't have to. If we were in a much stronger position than we are now, of course we could have forced the government's
Yes.
hand and maybe made a deal with them that was more beneficial. But it's simple, real politics. Um, they don't have to. They simply don't have to. The white electorate is so small that you can disenfranchise all the white people in South Africa and you will still take over the government. So in other words, as a power base, we are too small to really make any difference. So there the government doesn't have to look at us. Economically, yes, we are still extremely strong economically, but then again, with the black empowerment laws, that is changing very
Mm-hmm.
rapidly. So in a couple of years from now, we're also going to lose the bargaining power as an economic entity. Um, Culturally, we are very a very small and I would really say an isolated group in South Africa.
Yes.
Um, so the long and short, if in real terms, neither the EFF or the ANC has to come to the bargaining table with Afrikaners. There's why would you do that? You can do it maybe for the rest of the world, for the world to see that you're the nice guy and you're granting rights to minorities, all these things. But that is contrary to the program that's already in place. And here's the problem. Here's the problem. Because of this bad publicity that you spoke about previously, um, I think most of the world is simply turning a blind eye to what is very obviously happening in South Africa. White people in South Africa are still being seen as the culprits
Mm.
because this has been the narrative that was painted of white South Africans during the apartheid days. So the average American and European still see white South Africans as the actual problem in South Africa. Uh, we're sitting in a very, very precarious position. And I think you sum it up. I, for one, cannot see in which direction we are supposed to go. A great white leader coming forward, uh, yes, let him come forward or her or whoever. But here's the question to that leader: what are you going to do?
Yes.
What are you going to
What
do?
can you possibly
Uh,
do?
we can have 100 leaders. We can have the strongest political party you can ever have amongst white people. But what are you going to do? Because why? 25 years ago, we gave away all the bargaining
Everything.
chips and all the power at once. So how are we going to recoup that? I'm not being negative. I'm a very opportunistic person and I'm a very optimistic person. But I'm also a realist, and my realism tell me that we are in very very serious trouble now.
And Scott, nobody is coming to your aid. I mean, that has been made very obvious, unless, and this is the only saving grace I see in a certain way for white South Africans, is the influx of African nations into all the white nations of the world. Um, there is an uprising against it. People are not so scared to be called racist or nationalist or Nazi or whatever, Islamophobe. They're not caring too much because they are seeing in Europe what the consequences are of welcoming these people with open arms. They are seeing the rape, the looting, the murders, the drain on their economies. So that is a possible turnaround for the world, is that the world sees that this is not a good thing and then they start looking at South Africa. It is possible, but I don't know if any country is not going to be so self-involved with cleaning up their own mess that they're going to have time or effort or money or resources to help the white South Africans.
Yes, Karen, and always this scenario I paint to people from foreign countries. You are looking at yourself in 10 years time.
Mm,
The people in Europe is now for the first time really experiencing multiculturalism.
Uh,
Um, North America, yes, you have it, but this is now the first time that you have this real huge
Invasion.
upsurge of non-whiteism and anti-whiteism.
Yes.
The white American population, and now I'm not being racist because I make a distinction between races. I'm once again just simply being realistic. The white population in America by 2050. Now we're not even close to 2050 now. uh, by 2050, you're going to be the white population is going to be a minority in North America.
Uh-huh.
That is the first time that you will experience how it feels to be a racial minority inside your own country. Um, that's the problem we're going to face, and it's going to be a time problem.
Yes.
Our
Yes.
problem is within the next 5 years. The rest of the world, maybe in 20 years' time, will realize, oh my goodness, we actually we were supposed to save the white South Africans because what is happening today to us happened 20 years back to them. But then it's going to be too late.
Yes.
Um, Fortunately, we're seeing a rise of more nationalist type of parties in Europe. Front National in France, now in Austria, in Hungary. So you have a shift to more nationalistic type of parties there. Um, I think many white South Africans also see Mr. Trump in the USA as a possible saving grace because he's made remarks about South Africa which indicate to us that he sees the problem. So we're rooting for Trump. Um, so that can definitely be to our advantage, and we will have to use that. My concern is one of time.
Mm.
I'm just very scared that we're going to run out of time before the outside world is going to realize what's going on in South Africa.
That is also my biggest worry because the media has been very good at drawing an absolute curtain around South Africa and South African events for the last 22 odd years. And now it is only small voices like my own, and there are others, but it is small voices throwing small pebbles into a big pond, trying to make a difference. And I don't know that we're going to be able to do it in time, although we've been working hard at it for a long time. And Trump, yes, I'm rooting for Trump as well, but Schalk, is he not going to have his hands full cleaning up the mess here? You
Well,
know,
I think either way, if either Sanders or Clinton wins or Trump
well,
on the other side, you're going to have troubles. That's there's no two ways about it. Um, you must remember something else also. The ANC the last 25 years has been genius at disguising what they are doing.
yes.
We're sitting with a world-class constitution, but in practice, that constitution means that we will never outvote the ANC.
Mm.
The EFF can maybe outvote them, but then we're going to end up with a more scary regime. So constitutionally, we're fine. So the rest of the world is looking into South Africa. And they see this wonderful constitution, and the government is actually following the constitution. They are not acting in contravention of this constitution. We still have an independent judiciary. The problem is just the judiciary doesn't have teeth. So you will have
Yes.
a court order, but nobody's enforcing the court order.
Uh,
But from the outside world, we still have a judiciary that's making court orders against the ANC. So you can go through all these things, and the ANC were genius with how they did these things. The affirmative action laws, if you read the law itself, for a person outside, not seeing the South African context, it seems as if the Employment Equity Act really promotes employment equity for everybody in South Africa, etc., etc. But it misses the actual real problem of white people being excluded because a majority must now being put into a workplace. And that is also a very very big challenge that we have. That the outside world must just see the truth for what it is, and they are missing it. I'm very sorry to say this, but they are terribly missing it. Uh, yeah, maybe because they have their own problems. We see the problems that's in Europe these days. The American economy has yeah,
Oh,
gained a little bit of speed the last 2 years or so, but you were facing your own problems. Uh, and so it becomes a huge paradigm shift, I think, for the outside world that they will have to go through before they realize this is what is actually going on in South Africa.
well, I don't remember who wrote it. It might have been Mike Smith from Mike Smith's political commentary. But anyway, it's a thing that really sticks with me is you will wake up one morning and wonder, where did the white people of South Africa go? And that line is my biggest nightmare because I fear that one morning I'm going to wake up and find that the white people of South Africa have gone. And then the world will say, ach, shame, and move on with their lives.
Yeah, and Karen, for the American listener, if I can be very negative in predicting your history, in 100 years from now, people are going to read in history books of at one point in time there were white people
Yes.
living in North America. That's
Well,
literally what's going to happen.
Schalk, if there
Um,
are history books, because I just worry if you look at the degeneration of decolonized areas of the world, um, where there are no longer whites. There are very few schools and very few history books and very few anything. So I
yes.
wonder even if we will be a footnote in history.
Yes, because you always sit with this contradiction. If an Asian person steps forward and he says, "I'm a proud Asian," everybody applauds him and say, "Well done for you."
Yes.
If if a black person steps forward and say, "I'm proudly black," I'm black consciousness. I'm proud of being a
Yay!
black person. Everybody applauds him, and I can go through all the races of the world. Then the white person steps forward and says, "I'm a proud white person," and all of a sudden, everybody says to him, "Yeah, well, you're a Nazi and you're a racist, and there's something wrong with you, and you're a psychopath." And why
Yes.
is there
Yes.
this terrible negativity about this whole thing? White guilt. Have you ever heard of something like Asian guilt? Have
No.
you ever? It doesn't exist.
No.
But
Only
what is
whites.
happening exactly in the Arabian countries? There's no way that they will have a mass influx of white Christians into Saudi Arabia. You can't imagine that for yourself.
They won't
But that
even
is
take these Islamic refugees. They won't take
they
them.
won't
They
take they
refuse.
they they won't take Muslim people into their
Yeah.
own country.
Yeah.
So somehow that is fine, but the moment that the European country closes its borders and say we're not going to take any Muslim immigrants, then all of a sudden,
It's not
for some
fine.
reason, that's extremely evil now.
Yes.
And we must get past those double standards. If white people are still seen as being privileged, that's also something that's disappearing because white people are not
Oh,
privileged
my
anymore.
Lord. Uh,
If you look at Asian people, and by the way, I have no problem with Asian people, but I'm using them as a real world example. Asian people are now on the rise as the most prosperous people on earth. So, and that is why I use the example of Asian privilege. Are we ever going to get to a point where we have Asian privilege? We're not going to get there
no.
because there's a narrative against people of white skin color. It's as simple as that.
Skulk,
Um,
we are
some,
about 30
yeah,
seconds from the end of the show.
yes. To sum up again, Karen, as I said at the previous time, I think we as white South Africans are sitting with a problem of extremely poor publicity, and we need to wake up, and we need to use platforms like your own and others to simply tell the truth and make the world see what's going on.
Thank you very much, Schalk. We will get back to the Nelson Mandela history of South Africa in a later show. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again, same time, same place, next week.